Sure, it's
Going to Facebook. 1 second. All right. Be going live here in a second. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Veterans Action Council Roundtable number 28. We have a special guest with us tonight. We're going once again back to the United Nations, and I'd like to welcome our special guest, Nazlee Maghsoudi. She has been working with our veterans that have been working at the level of the UN for quite some time. And we're basically from here, we're going to have a discussion about what things are, what we've been doing. But more importantly, it's to get Ms. Nazlee's specific take on a few things. For some reason, I'm having some technical difficulties still cutting and pasting any of the questions. Michael, would you like to make a formal introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working now in Vienna since but in New York on drug policy at the United Nations since 1998. And back in 1998, when we came in, there was a New York NGO committee, but already at that time in 1998, already was almost on mothballs. It really wasn't active anymore. I guess they were most active when he was put on the table. That was like 1988. And then I guess from 1988 to 1998, somewhere in the middle there, or towards the end, active. And that was one of the things that we did, around after 2008 was work on bringing the New York NGO committee back distance. And I think you're the just second chair since the New York NGO committee was brought back. The previous chair, Rosalind Harris, who was 91 years old when we found her, and she was very, very, very happy to see us and very happy to bring back. But I think for the purposes of this call and for our meeting today, I'm hoping that if people come really understanding what it is that we're talking about in New York, the UN there, and the New York UN in with regard to drug policy, why do we talk about that in drug policy? Why is it relevant? Is the NGO itself? What does it mean to be joining together as NGOs and working with the UN? And what is this New York NGO committee? What is it by itself? What is it together with the Vienna NGO committee? So I think that is somewhat ambitious, but I feel so glad and happy that you agreed to come with us and spend some time with the Veterans Action Council and talk about these things. And I really feel very, very glad myself to see you and welcome you to our council. And with that, I guess no further ado, that's kind of leaves it open for you. You had talked about sort of a general purpose sort of presentation, but feel free to introduce yourself, what you like saying about yourself, and how you come to meet us. I feel like forum here, but that's Nazlee Maghsoudi, and the chair, and welcome to the Veterans Action Council table.
wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael, and thanks to everyone here today. Really pleased to have been invited to participate in this round. Dive in to my presentation. So I wanted I think, Michael, you really kind of overview about some of the topics we want to cover today, just to give a little bit of an agenda about what I'll cover in these next 15 minutes or so. First, I'll give a bit of an overview of the international drug control regime to make sure we're all have a common understanding, and then specifically speak about the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, or the CND, as I'll call it, which I know some members of VAC have experience with, others may be newer to that forum. So we'll speak about what that is, what they do, and then how civil society, how NGOs, Commission on Narcotic Drugs. What can you do? What can't you do? How does it maybe look a bit different than your other advocacy? And then I will just flag a couple relevant stakeholders to be aware of before getting into a discussion with all of you. So beginning with the international drug control regime, folks may err, but it's important to know that really the basis of the drug control regime is the 3 international drug control treaties. 1971, 19 treaties, and those are considered to be the cornerstone, it's often called, of the international drug control regime. And what's really about this regime and how it maybe differs from other areas of the UN is that this really it's incredibly far-reaching. A vast member states, in fact, 184 of 193 UN member states are party to these treaties. They've adopted these treaties, they've agreed. So how far-reaching the jurisdiction of the UN drug conventions are and the international drug control regime is globally. Now, of these conventions is to limit the production, distribution, and use of drugs to scientific and medical purposes. So in that sentence, 2 goals, right? There's this goal of restricting supply and demand to only medical and scientific purposes, so permitting supply and demand for non-medical, but in tandem, making sure you do have access for medical and scientific purposes. Now, despite these dual goals and the fact that the convention overwhelmingly concerned with what's welfare of humankind or mankind, the overwhelming focus has been placed on the strict on repressive law enforcement measures, punitive approaches. The provision of drugs for medical and scientific uses have been really neglected, even the expense of the other goal being prioritized. And as a result, much of the world goes without relief. So it's something like 20% of the world uses 80% of all the pain meds in the world, and the rest are left with that remaining amount, which is of course insufficient. So, and about how the objectives and how they actually play out in practice. So having said that, just a little bit about the control regime, its basis, who it applies to, what its aims. So firstly, what is the CND, right? This is the central policymaking body for the UN drug control system, for this international drug control regime that I was just speaking about. Up at 53 UN member states, they're elected by the Economic and Social Council of the UN, and they have a geographic distribution of seats. However, states that actually are engaged in the Commission on Narcotics and holders as well. We'll talk about some UN agencies that engage in those 53 UN member states. They are responsible, just the 53 of them, for scheduling decisions, which we'll talk about as the CND. So just to say that the CND, it meets every year. Usually it's in March for about a week. Earlier this year, it was in April, and it was virtual. It was not in Vienna, March 14th, 18th, although the structure, whether it'll be in person, that's really the main meeting that I'll really be thinking about that in the spring. Do also reconvene in December. Usually it's just the next year, but there was an exciting one, of course, last year because the WHO, the World Health Organization's recommendations for cannabis rescheduling were voted upon by the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. So that was more exciting than in typical reconvenes. And of course, the CND does also meet kind of as needed. Now, based on the high-level meeting that happened in 2019, they're carrying out a couple every October where they speak about specific thematic issues. 2019 meeting. So now I would like to really just actually say what the CND does, right? So having understood what they are, their goal, what are their functions. So they're mandated by the UN Control Conventions to consider all the issues objective of those treaties. A few things. So they do mirror its state of play, if you will, on drug policy around the world. Member states kind of come together to update each other on drug control activities, the impacts it's having. Unfortunately, how that often looks is reports about the number of crimes eradicated, the number of drug seized. But there are, of course, member states and a growing number of member states in some regards that aspects that perhaps more reform or oriented folks would like to see, such as things like decriminalization, things like harm reduction. Yes, it is a place for this global discourse and members to really connect on this global matter of drugs. Now, I mentioned the role in scheduling. That's the CND's function. They are fundamentally the group that schedules, reschedules, deschedules. The World Health Organization is mandated by the conventions to conduct assessments, medical and scientific assessments of substances, and to advise on their scheduling. And that's specifically the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, which some of you know through the work around cannabis in recent years. But this is something that the CNE, those member states, they can either adopt or reject the WHO recommendations by vote. And the vote, the majority depends on the convention, but it's just to say that they do not have to adopt what the WHO recommends. States are, of course, the ones who make decisions for themselves, not the UN agencies or UN bodies. Another function that's worth flagging here is the adoption of resolutions. These are done every year by member states at the CND and to give guidance, right? So they're around specific thematic areas. They give policy guidance. They maybe assign activities to UN agencies or monitor their activities. What's most important to understand about, I'd say, the CND at large, if you're really thinking about trying to grasp how this place works, decisions that are made here, and also any high-level documentation, any outcome documents, anything that comes out of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, all of these decisions, and this is different from other places in the UN where we'll go to around contentious issues. What it's called is the Vienna Consensus. And what that means in practice is that, of course, our international drug control kind of system right now is characterized by really divergent perspectives, right? Countries that have moved ahead with the regulation of cannabis for non-medical use, right, for adult use. And then we have countries that still use the death penalty. So if all of these member states with really different perspectives are going to agree, they're going to come to a consensus, imagine the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, it's the lowest common denominator. It's what everyone can agree to. So it has to be somewhat broad. It has to mean one thing to someone and another thing to someone else. And sometimes to some people, it won't mean anything at all. So really that is how the body functions by consensus. What that means is that gains are really, they're incremental, they take time, and you're building upon what's called agreed language. So, okay, this consensus around last year or the last time we talked about this topic, in what way we advance that this time? What tweaks can we make to the language? What additional pieces can we add that can incrementally move us closer to what we ideally see, right? But they need to negotiate with folks that may very well disagree based on their own domestic approaches to drug policy. So I think hopefully, and we can talk about that more, that's really characteristic of this forum, and it dictates the outcomes that come out of this group. One piece that I want to just say here, like, why does this matter? During the discussion as well about kind of the implications from like the local to global connection, but just kind of the way I look at it is that the Commission on Narcotic Drugs and the kind of the international drug control regime, they set the box within which national drug policies. It's the parameters within which this is our global approach to drug control, and that can change and that can be tweaked. And as we make improvements and incremental advancements in language the domestic policies that stimulate changes, those that trickle up, trickle down in this perceived as an international drug control system, or what member states feel they can do, what flexibility is perceived because of what other member states are doing, because of how language has advanced. So I just wanted to say that off the top, but certainly we can talk more about why this all matters during the discourse, because I know sometimes it seems a little bit far off. Now I've explained the international drug control regime, I've explained the CND. I wanted to just speak about how civil society can engage at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. Society attends on behalf of non-governmental organizations that have consultative status with the Economic and Social Council. Some civil society government delegations where they're actually there as a member of the government, even though they're representing civil society in the context of the government's delegation. But I'll stick to talking about how civil society typically attends, which is on these NGO passes, these which are only given to civil society that has consultative status with the Economic and Social Council. Gaining access to this space is only possible through these passes, and it's what civil society is permitted to do in that space is different from thinking about the spaces that civil society is allowed. Those are different from where government is allowed. Spaces at the CND that are government only, things like negotiations where member states, before they're more publicly or in a setting where all civil society can watch, they have private hand, or they have bilateral meetings where it's just a couple member states or a group of member states speaking just member states only. So of course, for a space where, right, this is an intergovernmental group. But it's also kind of worth, before we talk about what can do here and how this can be a place for advocacy, what you cannot do and how it's maybe different than the ways that in the forums or the places that you maybe more typically conduct activism, and why it's a little bit different and the approach is a little bit different. So because we're there under these NGO passes, there are certain rules that need to be followed and ways that we need to function in those spaces. I'll just a couple examples of that. So one is, I think typically, and advocates will be quite maybe direct in their advocacy, right? You'll say XYZ that this country is doing is not appropriate, or whatever it is. In this space, you really cannot pinpoint member states. It's not a space for what they would call naming and shaming. That's characterized by diplomacy, by professionalism, by etiquette, like the type of flowery language, oh, distinguished delegates, my excellencies, like even when they're disagreeing with one another, it's couched and it's framed in this diplomatic, professional language. You can still say things that are maybe critical of the international drug control system, of certain domestic policies that different, but you cannot say this country is doing this. So a little bit different, but you can still do it. It's just how you frame it, how you couch it, how you word a little bit different. The other example that I wanted to give here was actually something that happened at the CND in 2019, where really issues, kind of ongoing issues between civil society and UN security services really came to a head. And it led to things like threats of expulsion, removal sanctions. And really what had happened was that the Philippines, which many of you will be aware for a number of years now, they've been engaged in extrajudicial killings and vigilante killings of people who use drugs, and have touted this as a great success, as model for what drug policy should look like. And they had a exhibition based within the Vienna International Center where the Commission on Narcotic Drugs was being held, and were kind of advertising prominently their policy. They had a big picture of their president and all touting all the great work that they've done, killing people who use drugs and people involved in. Of course, understandably, this was really upsetting the civil society advocates that were there, human rights defenders. And what they decided to do was, about maybe to 20 people that were civil society participants at the meeting, they held a protest, is what they called it. They all lay down on the floor in front of the exhibition that Philippines had. And the idea here was to the gravity of the situation to draw attention to these killings. Really alleges, of course, with human rights. We know that drug crimes are not the most serious crimes for which the death penalty or any other types of extrajudicial killings can be used. It's not in alignment with human rights. So despite of their concerns and their protests, security were quick to get onto that scene and started taking names. And the issue here was that the protest had not been pre-approved, and it was consequently a violation of the UN security's rules. Consequence of that violation, there was this real risk that these participants who were there on these ECOSOC consultative status, that this could have an impact. It could status of the organizations which they were there representing or which they were using their pass for. So thankfully, it did not escalate. There were kind of prolonged committees and security there. But really the message was clear that the CN is a member society. And any protest, they must be pre-notified, they must be approved, or they can be held outside. Protests often happen just outside the doors, but this was inside and the conditions were different. And in fact, at that same CND, just a few days later, there was another incident with security where it was actually a pre-approved event, and they were perhaps overeager to come in and enforce their concern about what civil society was doing, which they were holding to. Even at the UNGAS, the UN General Assembly Special Session on Drugs, folks were told that a cannabis leaf on their shirt was considered a protest. It's something to be aware of, and it's something to make sure that you're playing by the rules so that you can remain in that space. Because when you don't, they're very quick to put their foot down and very, I don't want to say happy to exclude civil society. They think that they hesitate too much to do that when situations like this come up. So that's what not to do. Can do before wrapping up with just some key stakeholders to be aware of. So what you can do at the CND, what are some ways that we can have influence that can go to the CND and kind of raise their concerns and try to make some progress at the international drug control regime. So one is certainly an opportunity to meet with and have regular communication with your member state, right? So thinking about my Canadian example, we meet with our Canadian government during the CND, after the CND. It's really an opportunity for us to learn about the emerging issues, their perspectives, and share our opinions about how Canada should be, what types of positions Canada should be taking at this stage. So that's one. You can use it as a touch point for your country, and also you can meet with other countries. It is one that you have an in with already, of course. And there is prepare policy briefs. That can be for your own country, that can be for other countries. There's an NGO. They're posted on the Commission on Narcotic Drugs website every session, so you can actually submit formal input to this meeting as ECOSOC accredited. And then you can also really provide input on the statements and positions of your member state. This is part of that, have that discourse, meet with when they're willing to share with you. It is a way to stand, how are you going to vote on the scheduling decision? How do you consider X, Y, Z? And then side events are really a key way civil society has been so engaged with holding these events. They're kind of on the margins of the official meetings. They're still official meetings, actually, Commission on Narcotic Drugs, but they happen outside of they're during lunchtime and in the morning, and they're places for maybe a little bit more controversial topics to be spoken of. V.A.C has organized those events, presented at those events, attended those. It's really a great space, and especially the virtual nature last year allowed for folks being at the CND or been present in those halls to get a taste by attending some side events, watching the virtual live stream, which some of you might have watched as well. I'll just add a couple of ways that civil society can engage at the CND. Certainly making statements. During the debates, there are often thoughts for civil society, time permitting, to speak. And those are often selected through the NGO committees, which I will mention. So it's a great way to kind of bring your research or your advocacy or your perspective and really share it with member states. And of course, it's a place to just share information. You can join discussions online There's eggs around CND. There isn't a lot of transparency around the international drug control regime. So it's quite important to make sure that those who aren't knowing what's relevant to them, and that online discourse is a way to do that. And I mean, typically, this is also, when it's in person, it's a great way to expand your network, distribute your publications, host exhibits, booths, but those require in-person participation. So just to wrap up, relevant stakeholders here that it's worth knowing. We've already talked about the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. We've talked about the World Health Organization. I mentioned the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Aware that this is the UN agency that is responsible for coordinating international drug control activities. They go by UNODC. About the INC, the International Narcotics Control Board. They are the self-described independent and quasi-judicial control body of the regime. They monitor accountable for assuring availability of medicines. And then the last UN stakeholder I just want to flag here is the UN System Chief Executives Board for Coordination. 31 UN agencies came together through this body for the first time to put forward a UN common position on drugs. And the composition is really one public health being prioritized, rights, development. It supports decriminalization for the first time as a UN family-wide position. In fact, the drugs and crime is one of the last, and specifically thinking about them as the ones who are most knowledgeable about, they had, at least to say it kindly, an ambiguous position on decrim, if anything, but they clarified it through that common position. So it's definitely something your advocacy. And then lastly, these NGO committees that I've mentioned. So there's the New York NGO Committee on Drugs, and there's the Vienna NGO Committee on Drugs. And we both are global committees with members around the world from all UN regions. And what we really do is we aim to support society in engaging with the UN system. In our practice, we facilitate exchange of information. We do things like civil society speaker selections, as I mentioned, that you can make statements and they're selected by these committees. You can actually become a member of these committees. You don't need to have consultative status with the UN to do that. It's a great way, if you're interested in becoming more involved with UN drug policy work, to just stay in, get readouts from meetings, briefings, and a way to get familiar with other NGOs that are doing this work that you could potentially partner with, work collaboratively. So I hope I haven't gone too long. I'll leave it there. And I'm really looking forward to some discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nazlee. I think you did great. I want to talk about one thing just to sort of illuminate it a little bit more, the stuff that you talk about, just one little thing. It's funny, in the early days, we used to hand out structure charts of the UN. We'd print out a nice glossy structure chart of the UN and then laminate it and give it to all the activists that were with us. And it really helps. It helps to see that structure chart and to sort of on. But especially for activists that we're working with in the United States to understand the ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council, is sort of the UN. There's, what is it, like 186 countries that have signed into the Drug Control Treaty, and those countries delegate their authority to like Nazlee said, representing, geographic representation and all this other stuff, but it's like 53 countries that on a day-to-day, or in this case, year-to-year basis to make these decisions. But it's very much these countries themselves that run this process, that dictate all the terms of the, it's not one of these things where they all just bow down to the UN process of some big leadership in the UN or anything like that. And I think that's important to just to highlight. As far as, there was one other thing too, as far as, and being on site, there are moments where, due to the time worked out, there could be a little bit of extra time at the end. It could be actually close to your mission of your organization, where an organization that is actually there and is in a position to talk to the secretariat in real time is able to take the floor many times without much fanfare, without a selection process or anything, but just by being part of the process, being able to speak relevantly to the subject matter that's on the agenda. So I just wanted that. But there's one last little question just to tie this off. But I've never seen you before, and I just want to hear your answer to what would you define to someone, you know, that's on an airplane on your way to Vienna that has nothing to do with anything, just met you on the airplane. How would you define civil society for them? Who is civil society?
That's a great question. I mean, I take a really broad perspective to civil society. For me, civil society, what sometimes people call NGOs, the third sector, these are groups that they're not government, right? Not private sector. They don't have kind of corporate interests, but they are this third sector. They're individuals, humans that are organizing around issues that they think are important, that are valuable to them, that they think there needs to be around, or some sort of advocacy is needed around, and they're organizing around that. So for me, civil society is, it can be universities, it can be nonprofit orgs, it can be community-based, you know, frontline groups. Really, there's such a plethora of different vantage points. It can be representing specific kind of populations, right? Veterans, it can be representing specific groups of folks that have shared kind of experiences and are coming together. Yeah, so I think that's how I would define it to someone on a plane.
Thank you. Amy, I think you've got the next question on our
I do.
list here.
Hi, Nazlee. Thank you for your terrific overview of the United Nations process for drug policy. Can the United States kind of see Uruguay and Canada as thought leaders on international cannabis term, because they've been making nuanced treaties and human rights-based arguments inside the UN. So that being said by other countries for or against cannabis policy reform, and give us your perspective on how the United States has been taking their approach at the UN conversations and decisions of policy there.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I'm definitely happy to speak to that. Yeah, I can start with kind of describing how the three, Uruguay, the United States, and Canada being the three kind of member states. Of course, the United States has, but the ones that have been questioned or have made justifications, provided rationale for their domestic cannabis policies and how they've done that. I can speak about the other side, what they say. So yeah, maybe Uruguay first, given that was the first to move in that. So with respect to how Uruguay has gone about justifying their non-medical, adult, recreational cannabis regulation that they've done domestically, some kind of sidestepping the issues or concerns around non-compliance or not being in violation of the treaty, kind of sidestepping that question. Done that is that they've argued that their policy is fully in alignment with the objectives of the treaties that the treaties haven't actually achieved, which, if you'll recall, is what I shared around the protection of the health and welfare of humankind, right? So Uruguay would say that their creation for adult use, it's driven by health and security imperatives. It's a human rights issue. As was noted in the question, they have provided a human rights justification or defense for their move towards cannabis policy reform. And specifically, they point to as taking precedence over international drug control, which absolutely it does. You know, all the high-level documentation that's out of this CNE, as well as other resolutions and other forums around drugs, always articulate that full compliance with human rights obligations is necessary. You cannot undermine human rights in a person's priorities. So really, it's so important, even though Uruguay, in some folks' perspectives, there's a bit of a disadvantage, reluctant to say that their move towards cannabis policy reform violates treaties, and there's some change to treaties that's needed there. that's very beneficial is that human rights argument. And so they have noted a little bit there are legal tensions without directly saying violation vision. So that's what Uruguay has done. And I think the human rights piece there is really important. The United States, which you've asked about, they've gone about it a different stepping, but more directly denying non-compliance, more directly saying that what some would say are more questionable legal are essentially saying that because the cultivation, trade, possession of cannabis that's taking place in multiple US states, that's permitted because it's federally illegal. As a federal government, they are party to these conventions. So federally, they're not in breach. That's their position. Now, of course, there have been moves within parameters to allow developments to occur. What folks might recall most, people that have followed this will point to is called the Brownfield Doctrine. Folks are familiar. This was Ambassador William Brownfield, I think 2014 at this point, a few years ago now, defending this move by saying that there's enough flexibility in the treaties to allow what is happening. And there's challenges around that, right? Because the US is signaling that their interpretation that a specific member state's agreements be permitted. It has implications beyond cannabis and drug policies, right? It has implications for other parts of the UN, the environment. There needs to be, every state cannot interpret joint agreements separately. There has to be some joint understanding, but certainly there is the discourse with the US has allowed for some opening up of conversation, but that has been kind of how have said that they're not in compliance and justified it because of the state level issue. And then just Canada, I think, is the other one. I would say what we've done, I haven't done it, is that they have really been the only ones to actually quite directly acknowledge that cannabis policy reform in Canada is not compliant with the treaties. Have kind of a respectful non-compliance position. They acknowledge that it's not compliant, but they also root it in the things like the UN principles, peace and security, development, health. And they also have taken an approach where they've really been clear to say, not telling any other member state to do this for Canada. This isn't a model for other member states to follow. And they've really been engaging with different UN agencies and bodies to kind of talk about what they're doing there. But yeah, so it's kind of different. We have sidestepping, we have kind of denying, we have acknowledging, but all this non-compliant, I should say, like this is part of how treaty systems, when treaty systems are, in my perspective, no longer fit for purpose, when there are some changes that are maybe necessary, these types of periods in non-compliance are often the case, that this is part of the process of developing international law and evolving it to be fit for purpose. So that the three most relevant states have justified cannabis changes. The states that are opposed, they're saying this is a violation. What message does this send to the world? Cannabis is a very dangerous substance. It's as dangerous as other Schedule I substances. That's all the rhetoric you've heard many, many times. So maybe I don't need to spend too long on the folks that were following the WHO cannabis votes will have seen really prominently kind of honestly fear-mongering type perspectives and prohibitionist countries, including around cannabis, have taken. So yeah, thanks for that question, Amy. I hope I answered it.
Your answer there leads perfectly into the next question, which Tony has, which is getting into the heart of maybe what will make a little more at ease and maybe activists in the United States as well, again, who have sort of an outside imposing force doing things to your country. What was your question there, Tony?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Nazlee, for explaining all the inner workings of the UN, because, I mean, the work you do there and policy change can affect a lot of countries where you mentioned they were actually killing people for cannabis and stuff. So I'm interested in how do control treaty system work at the UN with respect to national sovereignty? Can you explain that?
Ah, okay. So yeah, I think it's important to kind of understand like what the UN is and kind of what the parameters are, right? And the regulators. The UN is an intergovernmental body, right? It's the member states that are coming together to be. It's the countries, they each have sovereignty for their respective countries. They're coming together to speak about this joint issue. This is distinct from the Secretariat, right? When we say UN, people, agencies, and that is a part of the UN for sure. There are many UN agencies and bodies that can inform the work. The decision makers are the members. UN, as in like UN Office on Drugs and Crime or the WHO or whoever, they don't impose things to member states. In fact, for example of they can make recommendations and the member states don't have to agree to them. So it's really the power in the hands of the member states. The member states, it's in clearly the conventions indicate that treaty interpretation is delegated to member states. And in fact, that comes to a head sometime, like mandate create things like the International Narcotics Control Board right now is putting together some guidelines in follow-up to the cannabis vote that happened in 2020. Some would say there's divergent views from member states and it should not be in any way authoritative. It should just be guidance from INCB. So this kind of where is the member states, their scope, and where does the mandate of UN agencies come in and how do those come together kind of comes up all the time. But really, yes, it is not whereby the UN is imposing something. It's member states coming together and discussing these things. And maybe just one thing to say here is like how important the issue is around this. I think in this area of the UN, they're talking about drugs, but in other areas of the UN, they're talking about a gamut of other issues, right? The pillars of the UN, peace and security development, and often drugs like undermines those things, right? It violates human rights. Just the example of Philippines alone illustrates that. So I think the role of the UN and government, it's like, yes, do your drug control work, but in that pursuit, don't undermine all the other parts of the UN you are collaborating or that have been enshrined in various declarations of human rights. And that's something that we often call, as I said, system-wide coherence, because the UN system, it's got to be pushing in the same way. You can't have parts of the UN system that are actually undermining the goals of the fundamental UN, why it was set up in the first place. So maybe that's a little there, but I kind of always like to stress that as we understand like how the UN works, who the decision makers there are, and what the risks are when one part of the system is going awry, which I would say the drug system often does.
Yeah, right. I think Wade, you were up next. You're on.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Fascinating conversation. I thought shaping policy in Sacramento, I'm in California, advocate for a number of years, and it's a slow process, shall I say. But what I really want to talk this idea that the Narcotics Control Board and the C&D are really shaping how drug policy is being implemented around the world, particularly on the question of I'm convinced that cannabis in and of itself can do no harm. It's prohibition that does the harm associated with cannabis. But particularly on cannabis, to me, it's one of the big lies that government has imposed upon our culture. It's that this is a dangerous and narcotic drug, when in fact it is an ally. So specifically, I wanted to ask you, why is it necessary for activists to take the time to do the conversations, to have, for the potential moment where you're in a person's mind, but they're still representing who they were sent by, and that's not going to change. because of the conversation you had. Really just a matter of changing one heart and mind at a time in an organization like the Narcotics Board? Or is it, how does this, and I assume that they welcome the public sector because they actually see they have a problem. It's not working, like you said. So how does is there a partnership there, even with the prohibitionist states in this organization, that's with the effort? Not to be rude, but yeah, it's
Thanks.
Does that make sense at all? Nice.
Yeah, thanks, Wade. No, happy to do my best to answer that, and you can pick up any parts that I missed. But I think a big part of your question, if I can take it back, saying in my presentation, is like, why should we even do this work, right? Like, what's the point? When you're there, what kind of impact can you have? What kind of influence can you have? Not the mechanics of the ways that I was describing, but beyond kind of the box example that I gave, we're moving it slowly. How can we, what is the point? Right. So I think there's a few different ways. And I guess I did start to allude to it because it's this global local connection in my perspective. So certainly there's this piece or the international forum and holding your own government accountable, right? Because what they're doing domestically may very well not be what they're doing internationally for work. It can also be that they're doing great things internationally and that they're not doing, and there's different countries where you can see that they say wonderful things on the international stage, but domestically, if you will. So that it's holding your government accountable and making sure that they are authentically representing what they're doing in their country on the international stage, and then pushing them to take those progressive positions, to highlight those progressive pieces. I did in 2021, earlier this year. Yes, my years are getting confused in COVID. We of course had the first time under President of the United States, President Biden, the Biden-Harris priorities for drugs were highlighted by the U.S. Regina Labelle presented. It's the first time that the U.S. had ever said the words harm reduction next to each other. And actually those two words, we can talk about this separately, but they've never appeared next to each other in anything coming out of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. It's incredibly contentious. So the U.S., in the role that they've taken historically, right, the U.S. in these spaces, for them to stand up and use the word harm reduction, that creates space for other member states who are not in the geopolitical positions what they will or what they desire to say, oh, some space is opened up. There's some fracturing here. Wow, the U.S., who has been harm reduction, has been very prohibitionist, that there's movement here that we catch on to and do things. So absolutely, I think it's holding your government accountable. It's putting them to say great things. It's recognizing that that has an influence on other governments. This is a global issue. There's also a piece too around like what you're doing. I mentioned in my presentation how the decriminalization endorsement came too late from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. So there's also this piece around system-wide coherence, right? Like UN agencies that work on women, that work on human rights. Like what is the relevance? We know that drugs is not spans across all of these different sectors, all the different social determinants of health, all of these issues. So making sure that UN agencies are showing up, saying positive things, highlighting the good work that they're doing, kind of waving the flag to show member states that these are the recommendations from the UN experts. Maybe one other thing, I think it linked to the last piece about what you were saying too, about working kind of across the aisle, if you will, or with people that you don't agree with. Reasons that I always say reform needs to go to the CND is because if we don't go to the CND, the drug-free world people are still there, the prevention people are still there. It's heard in that forum, right? It's really important for us to be there because if we're not, the progressive agenda, the reform agenda doesn't accelerate heard in the same way. But still, we have to absolutely work with those civil society actors, that maybe the ones that we disagree with, that have drug-free world or that aren't what our focuses are. And these committees that I'm in, the NGO committees, they represent a gamut of views. There's drug policy from both sides of the aisle that work on civil society that works on all drug policy issues have differing perspectives. And that's really important for many reasons. Legitimacy is a key one, because drugs are seen as so stigmatized and controversial, and they're having only reformed voices. People that can legitimize you in some ways, even if that is absolutely the direction we need to go, right? Like, unfortunately, there is legit gain. Maybe not unfortunately, but there's power in numbers, right? And there's power in working across the aisle, and the stakeholders that you want to persuade are often that there is a diversity in perspective. Like our NGO committees, when we make civil society selections, we have to consider regional diversity, gender logical diversity, just a variety of factors that need to be balanced. So yeah, just in the same way that member states have diverse towards each other, civil society has divergent views. Although we have consensus, I would say, around things like death penalty and stuff, but certainly other issues. Decrim too is another one. More harm reduction, still contentious for some folks. Certainly regulation, legalization is contentious. But we need to work with them to make sure that our collect out is possible. Thanks, Wade.
I think that's a really, yeah, great, a great. I think, did you have a follow-up on this, A? So Pearson also had a follow-up. So first Amy with a quick follow-up, and then Pearson.
Jump in because, you know, as we talked about the side events that happen, and what we see, what we've begun, reformists come in fighting against the prohibitionists, we end up with these polarized, you know, prohibitionists giving their side of a story, and then we have the drug policy reform. What I've enjoyed doing is going into the prohibitionist side events and discussions and interject other idea streams. So they have very fine narrative. And when you come in and you ask questions, which you can interject or ask a question, this is a good opportunity to engage dialogue with them. Now, a lot of times they're resistant, but what I have found, and I think, Michael, you would agree as well, a lot of times after you've interjected in one of these prohibitions and you've engaged, people will come up to you afterwards as they see you in the hall and want to continue, or will ask for follow-up information regarding your position or statements that you might have made. So I think that is, even though it's such a huge system for us to work in, drug policy changes do kind of happen one person at a time. It's been a slow go, but I think that for me, that's the hugest impact. If our organization isn't holding a side of it, that we can participate and try and change the conversations.
I totally agree. Sorry, just to reply to that. I mean, as you said, often, because it's such a polarized issue, it's just you're speaking to the choir. It's just people in the room that already agree with you. So it is so great to use, like, try, you know, there's so many great side events from your reform orgs and your reform friends and you, but try and go to some of those other ones that you know are not necessarily going to be ones you agree with, and try to ask a question, try to engage, because yeah, absolutely, time, and it's such a important opportunity to have that discourse. And I'm sneaky sometimes. I try to name my side events that you can't quite tell. Like one we did recently, I called it primary and secondary prevention, and then some subtitle, because secondary prevention, if folks, is actually kind of another term for harm reduction. It's the idea of preventing harms, not preventing use. So it's secondary prevention. But I don't know, I feel like I maybe got some prevention people in the room, and we're talking about harm reduction. We also talked about prevention. I mean, really evidence-based education types prevention that includes harm reduction. But yeah, you have to be creative to get some people in the room. But certainly we should be making an active effort to go into those spaces, even if we're not always able to get them into our spaces.
I think that the whole conversation is so incredibly important because talking to the choir, has negative consequences on both sides. Pearson, do you have a follow up as well?
Yeah. So with the treaty, how does that affect the cannabis policies in America? I mean, it seems like we just jumped ahead into it along with Canada. Is there a reason for that, or what is the effects of it?
Okay, yeah, sorry, Pearson, I thought you had a follow-up on the last question. So that next question, we actually had invited Kenzie and Farid and a couple other folks, but they're in Madrid time zone, and it's like 1:10 in the morning, now 2 o'clock in the morning, asleep, and hopefully having nice dreams right now. We wish you would, Kenzie. But that's kind of a question, and the next question from Amy is a question that would be for our camp to answer. Basically, the in the United States in the cannabis movement, about this intense activity of the federal government and Slinger, the infamous, former alcohol prohibitionist, coming in with the stuff out of the movies. It was all first publications, the famous yellow journalist publications. It really is stuff just really absolutely made for a movie script. This history of cannabis, we did it, and we have Nixon, which was behind the even coined the phrase war on drugs, and the enforcer of the drug policy, for the last 50 years or so, very much so. If you fall out of line with the drug control treaties, the drug control treaty system doesn't send the International Narcotics Control Board after you. The United States comes after you and will decommission you from their, most favored trade partners or whatever it is that they sanction you for not towing the line on drugs. That's always been the punishment. So anyway, that's given people the impression that we're the driving force for this whole thing. And in fact, we weren't. We reluctantly joined up on this. And 1961, with our signing into, again, reluctantly signing in, believe it or not, signing into the drug control treaty, and signing on to the United Nations Drug Control Treaty for the United States. And then we ratified it. So that was ratified some 10 new federal law, our 1971 Controlled Substances Act, which was in fact put into place because Timothy Leary, as you know, in the Supreme Court against the Marijuana Tax Act. Marijuana Tax Act, the previous federal law was found unconstitutional, and the new omnibus law got rid of the marijuana tax, and it got rid of the previous 1914 Harrison's Narcotics Control Act, and became the new controlled. Read the Controlled Substances Act as I have. You'll see the treaty is written all the way through it. There's all kinds of stuff about not just this treaty with the marijuana, but also the 1971 treaty that has the hallucinogenics and stuff like that in it. So actually written into our law. It's not so much that the United Nations will come and enforce the treaty on the United States if we do. It's actually been when we tried to reschedule it and we couldn't reschedule it, when we tried to study it and we couldn't study it, when we tried to have the V.A.C policy and we couldn't. All these different things all stem from the federal government's resistance that flowed directly from our and woven into our Controlled Substances Act. So this is the thing, just to make it really clear, because it's probably muddy as hell. We're contemplating new law in the United States that would reform our marijuana laws at the federal level, and it would disregard this. It wouldn't have the treaty aspect at all anymore. It would basically disengage us from this process. It would remove cannabis. The proposed language as it stands would remove cannabis from control completely, deschedule it. So if we do that, then this wouldn't matter anymore. Again, this treaty stuff is written into our 1971, our current federal law. It's written into the in 1971 Controlled Substances Act. So until we change that law, the current law, the treaty actually means quite a bit. But I just want to make that so absolutely clear. It's not because the treaty is something that we signed into and there'll be a big club that'll hide. It's actually because of the way it's written into our federal law. And again, if you get into high level fights with the DEA, you'll find yourself quickly hearing the DEA cite the international treaty as part of their reasoning and why they have to do this or have to do that. As I found in ASA versus the DEA, where I was a veteran working for standing in that case. So I hope that makes that clear. And then Amy, you had one more on the end there.
Yeah, and I think it's funny, just to follow up real quick to my thing. It's funny that our drug control policies violated the spirit of the treaty. Even though they mention the spirit of the treaty, they violate the spirit of the treaty by preventing research on cannabis altogether, and allowing medicinal access. And I go, well, yes, we have Marinol in the United States, but that's a synthetic substance. And then you have Sativex and Sesamet. I mean, England, that has the largest production of cannabis in the world, yet inside of they cannot get prescriptions for any of it. So you have no access. You have a country that's profiting off of the medicinal plant substance as a drug, but yet prevents its own citizens from having that. We have the same thing in the US. There were drugs available, absolutely zero access outside of Marinol. So they violated the, as far as I'm concerned. So, but can we, moving on into that, can we talk about, to Nazlee, drug treaty having actually no mandate outside of research or medicinal application? As I told you, section 2, there's a very clear exemption for the cultivation of cannabis for what is specifically said industrial purposes or horticulture purposes. Does that treaty exemption for industrial use a loophole that we need to drive drug policy changes in these varying national policies? Canada's obviously, but I mean, could that be a venue for other national push their drug reform inside of their own country?
If you want, Nazlee, I can talk about that for a second, and if you have any thought on we've been looking, when I say we, our little team there, consisting of our veteran groups under Veterans Action Council, and also FAT, the Foundation for Alternative Approaches for Addiction Treatment, think tank and do tank over in France, still somewhat alive and contributing a little tiny bit through Farad and others. And also we do work quite closely with NCOD, the European and NGO coalition. But anyway, what we're looking at is, how do we move forward the treaty with, let's say that just happens, what I just described earlier. We pass a law in the United States that actually just totally disregards, completely removes cannabis from control. What do we do? What do we say? How do we approach this at the United Nations is sort of logically come up after that were to happen. I think a lot of people are just trying to envision that and imagine that happening. They're not ready to imagine what happens next. But that's what we're focusing on, is what happens next. And I think it's pretty logical. You see, we have interpretation of this drug control treaty that's rather new, actually, in our research. we found that if you go back a little bit further, what you, at least this is my interpretation, that the treaty was looking at the majority of the substances that they were trying to control as the ones that they created. They didn't really envision having a world where they had pharmaceutical-like drugs that weren't created by big, huge, government, by government-controlled industry. I don't think they ever envisioned fentanyl being dumped into a vat of back in the hills of somewhere in the Americas. I really just don't think they envisioned that. And for that reason, having drugs being created out in the hills, which I think the cannabis movement is pretty much with the anti-drug movement and saying, we'd like to see less fentanyl out on the street, please. That's something we would actually agree on with our opposition. But anyway, interpretation of the treaty, looking at it as some sort of a thing that's going to eliminate the use of these substances, that's not at all. The treaty's commentary and all, and you understand how industrial use, the exemption of industrial use, works in the treaty. It works in a way that allows governments to have legitimate trade in a substance or otherwise controlled material would otherwise be controlled as a drug if it's being used in trade in a way that's not drug. And the one example I loved in the commentary being used, I believe it was like in a film photography developing, and when it was used in that controlled as a drug, it was just a film photography developing product. And the thing about it is that I think there's another couple of things that the 1960s, let alone the 1930s and further back, never would have imagined. And that is that we'd ever be talking about cannabis as a productive thing for wide-scale use in public. You're talking about government creating policy for cannabis to be controlled for that, for wide-scale use in public, not for medicine, not necessarily for medicine, not research purposes around medicine. And that failure to envision is, yet another one of the things that has prevented the treaty from being relevant in the 21st century. And there's been a lot of discussion around fighting the treaty head on and amending it, all really a full thought. There's whole books that have been written about how a particular country might pull out of the treaty and reapply with reservation or another, but never really, to my knowledge, any cannabis activist book that ties it all together and says what would happen next. How would we then take that to some sort of rewrite the treaty? So that's interesting. And then there's these inter se treaty modification amendments that have been proposed, which would be an actual document that a bunch of countries would sign and sort of rebel against the treaty, create what you might call a free zone. Like in alcohol, we had the dry counties and wet counties. This would be dry counties and wet counties at the international level for cannabis. That's feasibly difficult to imagine, a handful of countries rebelling against the rest of the countries and being led by a couple of big countries to then a big stand as to create a document like that. I frankly, it's been just kind of hard for us to picture. And again, the folks that are putting this forward, what's next in their vision of what would happen next? I mean, after the interest, how does that then tie back into updating the treaty, amending it? So I think, and we think, that what's going to happen is cannabis is going to be seen as an industry, regulated by government, by citizens, based on age requirements and whatnot, as we do with adult regulated access. I think that's where it's going to be of no concern to the drug control program, because it'll be regulated by governments as an industrial exempt. And right now, you can look at Delta 8 as the knock on the door, if you've been studying and following Delta 8 and how it's coming from an exempt and it's confusing the whole situation, because it also can be derived from cannabis extract as well, which would be a controlled substance of that industrial exemption. But I think this is not a big deal. It's actually something within the treaty that is allowed for a that several countries could just look at this industrial application differently and apply it a little differently, and have it only applied to those countries that have interpreted it that way is actually law. And we think that's kind of where we're going to probably go. So we're going to be writing up a document that really lays out the groundwork for this. That's our launch date. We're going to be seeking some funding to send a bunch of vets over to Vienna to participate. But that's kind of where we're leaning towards, idea of countries all getting together. And this is the thing, we're getting cannabis out of the loop, but that doesn't mean the job's done. The treaty still sucks. The whole thing is defunct. Like I said, we're not able to stop those guys and gals, maybe unfortunately, from dumping fentanyl into a vat of homemade and selling that on our streets, which we all, I think here can agree, is something that we don't want to see. So, and they're not able to keep up with these new drug substances. The constant flow of little twists on the chemical. You want it with carfentanil instead of just fentanyl. So anyway, that's where industrial application, and this is next level stuff. This is where we hope governments will go, but I think it's not going to be that big a leap. It's there. I think what most people need to say is, you know, the recreational use, a lot of these concepts that we throw around, they're not in the treaty. They're not defined in anywhere. They have just, you know, very limited language to confine what they're looking at. And industrial use is what we've been applying to hemp, which is half of cannabis already. What do you think, Nazlee?
Mike, you answered the question well, and maybe just one thing I would pick up on, one of the last pieces you were saying here, and it's not specific to cannabis, but it's about the internet and really just prohibition as a whole. You were noting examples like carfentanil, right? The emergence of the endless emergence and often more harmful substances. And I just wanted to raise this because it has a few words, a few different concepts that try to refer to this. Maybe an effect. It's this idea that, you know, like a balloon, if you push in one area, that air doesn't go anywhere. It just pushes somewhere else, right? So it's this, the more you schedule, the more you crack down with your law enforcement approaches on specific substances, all that does is replace those substances with other substances. And often substances in accordance with what's called the iron law of prohibition that are more potent, that are emergent, like new psychoactive substances, right? Many of those are trying to replicate traditional drugs, but they're tweaking certain chemical compounds, just getting for substances that humans have used for decades, if not like millennia. So this is, yeah, I think something really important to understand about why the underpinnings of scheduling is fundamentally flawed. There are endless chemical compositions. We will never catch up, and it will only lead to more death and more harm. And the fentanyl example is one. It's also like, you know, the legal and illegal markets are not, it's one drug market. It's a relationship between Oxycontin clampdowns, which led to increases in synthetic fentanyl. And not to demonize fentanyl. I mean, fentanyl is a substance that in medical context can be, it has been used for many, many years. And there are people who use drugs that use fentanyl and like fentanyl and can tolerate fentanyl. But the issue in the unregulated drug market, when you don't know it's there, when that's not one you bought, when it's in there at a higher quantity than you're expecting. And that is the nature of the market, right? You don't have control. It's a lack of control. You're controlling drugs. You have a lack of control over them. So yeah, I always just like to bring up the balloon illustrates just how, yeah, the ways in which the direction needs to completely change.
I would also highlight that pull cannabis, the regulated adult regulated market, whatever, out of the mix, it still leaves medicinal cannabis in with cannabis preparations that are very strong or whatever in with the rest, in with this what Kenzie calls the frame pharmaceutical distribution and research. That needs to be revamped. The World Health Organization has made it very clear just by simply placing a substance under control in this drug treaty regime at any level inhibits and prevents legitimate patients, and that's just an unacceptable thing. So again, the treaty needs to be reformed. I threw out, and I consistently say that we're in this sustainability. The UN has created this sustainability goal of 2030 international
Sustainable Development
what's the
Agenda,
program?
the SDGs, right?
Yeah.
The goals or the agenda.
And the owner, I think, wouldn't you agree that the majority, if not all of them, can't exist, can't coexist with of the sustainability of the 17 goals that they laid down on sustainability?
Oh, absolutely. Like the issue around system-wide coherence, like there's mutual incompatibility. Like they're not compatible, right? And a prohibitionist approach fights directly in a lot of ways, certainly undermines health in very many ways. Development, thinking about countries that are, many people rely upon production just to have a means of surviving and a way to feed their family. Approaches like crop eradication and the prevailing kind of ways of suppressing absolutely undermine development, absolutely undermine human rights, like their access to food, their all of that, right? And poverty and all of these things are so related. So certainly there are SDGs, like SDG 3, which is the one around health. It has an explicit target there around HIV. So that one is kind of the one that people point to as being linked. A few others that are like very linked to drugs as well. But certainly I think a case could be made for all of them. And it does go back to my perspective. It's not the issue. It's about all the other issues. Drugs is like a symptom and like not really the center of what we're talking.
Pearson, I think you had a follow-up, or was that a leftover message?
So when it comes to enforcement, we have the DEA is all over the world with assisting other foreign countries and their issues with drugs. And I think they justify it by that they're preventing the substances crossing into our borders. They want to cut the snake off at the head, or if we become federally illegal, and I guess this is more of a U.S. policy question. Would the DEA, could we still expect the DEA to go and help enforce drug traffickers that are trafficking things that like cannabis that we recently, or if we legalize it, is that something that we could still see? Because I feel like we might be taking a lot of jobs. We start legalizing stuff, and I think that's one of the biggest issues that we're confronting. But any insight on that?
I think it's a fascinating question. What do you think, Nazlee?
I mean, I think they would, because there's a lot of drugs for, right? So for coca, for opioids, like I think they would continue their counter narcotics work. I mean, maybe it's in other jurisdictions too, I don't know. But certainly I don't think if they move, just like with Canada, right? There's been shifts around cannabis. Drugs are unfortunately, our government has not come to a position yet to recognize all the same reasons that we need legalization apply to those substances as well, even to a greater extent for those that are killing people. So yeah, unfortunately, I think they would still be active, and it does kind of go back to what I was saying a little bit, just about how the justification that there is enough flexibility for member states to do what they want, like the Brownfield Doctrine, exceptionalism reeking, because they go to countries and they enforce the treaties, right? And of course, there's this history of them being that way. So Bolivia, for example, wanted an amendment related to coca chewing, because that's a traditional something that their indigenous folks and their population does, and that the U.S. adamantly opposed that, right? And so they're saying, oh, we're interpreting the treaty this way, you're not compliant. So like yeah, I think that they're, unfortunately, I would suspect counter narcotics efforts would continue. It's deeply ironic when they're giving themselves the pass to say, oh, we're interpreting it this way. So it's another one of the dangers, I think, of FAR, and hopefully it can evolve towards one that's more productive and can lead to advancements in the system. Yeah.
It's going to be quite a transition for us, for sure. You know, the DE have a serious transition. You know, the way that we do it now is unsustainable, and you know, eventually you have to acknowledge that you can't go on forever in the wrong direction. Thank you so much, Nazlee. I really appreciate you coming on and going through these things. The drug control treaty, you know, it's one of these things, when we were talking about the industrial use, one of the first things that came up is, wow, you know, or cocaine or something like that, the opposition could get a hold of this thought and just destroy us, you know. Don't tell Kevin Sabet about this, you know. But the thing is, the industrial use relies on a country not just being able to say with a straight face that this has a value to society that can be met with the benefits outweighing the risk. Not only can they say that, but they can back that up. They're going to have to back that up. They're definitely going to have to back that up, because industrial rules brings you out of the drug control program in Vienna, but it dumps you off in Geneva, the World Trade Organization, or World Intellectual Property Organization, or I think that's the answer to someone about heroin is, yeah, that could conceivably happen, but the benefits and the risks argument is very different for heroin, for large scale use, than it would be for cannabis. And we've actually had an open scale, you know, open experiment of cannabis access worldwide, you know, for this entire century, and heroin. And we know what those both look like. So that would be my last thoughts on that. But again, thank you. I think again, you're back and can take over the mic.
Yes, thank you. I apologize. I'm having some technical difficulties tonight, but needless to say, Nazlee, I look forward to meeting you in person, hopefully in Vienna here in March, if it still is ongoing. It has been a fascinating discussion, needless to say, over this past hour and a half, and I can't thank our guides and sages who are educating us. Councilmember Kowalski had to leave, but I want to thank council members Amy King, Michael Krawitz, who are guiding us on this UN education, and with great teachers like Nazlee, we're going to have no problem picking this up. And I would also like to thank Councilmember Michael Krawitz, Pearson Kennedy Crosby, and Wade Laughter for joining us. It is a pleasure, as always, to have y'all on, and we will continue this discussion as we build momentum towards things coming in March, and we look forward to that. And to our next discussion, we'll see you all in 2 weeks for VAC Roundtable number 29, and we wish you all the best.
You missed
I was gonna say, and Tony Landry
I
too.
missed Tony Landry. Sorry, he came in. Well,
How can you miss him? He's always
oh,
the
there
best
he is.
looking.
Sorry, my apologies. So,
right.
yeah.
Always the most professional.
Yeah. Thank you, ATN.
like the Hollywood Squares. He's right in the middle.
Thanks, Nazlee. Yeah, but thank you so much for it's opened my eyes to where I can go and look for some more research and learn some more about it. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you all so much. It was really a privilege and a pleasure to be here tonight. So have a great rest of your weekends, and hope to meet you all in person soon and seeing you in the UN halls or engaged in this work.